many other...
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Nick Harper, and in this bulletin we'll bring you the latest on developing stories from around the world. Before we begin, let's take a quick look at the headlines. North Korea fires 2 ballistic missiles into the sea, according to the South's military, just days after Pyongyang said it had successfully tested new long-range cruise missiles. Taiwan conducts anti-invasion drills amid tensions with China and lands fighter jets on a makeshift runway, simulating what they would do if their air bases were damaged by enemy forces. Californians vote overwhelmingly to keep their Democratic governor, Gavin Newsom, rejecting a Republican attempt to unseat him in a special recall vote spurred by mask mandates and COVID lockdowns. The European Commission President says the EU must find political will to build forces that can intervene militarily without US support, keeping up the momentum for a European defence force. (1,400 dolphins slaughtered in a single day in the Faroe Islands of Denmark as part of the Danish territory's centuries-old traditional Grindadrop hunt. Well, for our top story today, let us take you back to the month of January. The world was still dealing with a deadly pandemic. America was battered by a heinous assault on democracy, and it was busy preparing for a peaceful transfer of power. But in the meanwhile, a top US general was so worried that Donald Trump was completely out of control that he phoned China over fears that Trump could order war. These are the shocking claims that are being made in a new book called Peril by journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa. According to the book, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called his Chinese counterpart twice. The first call was on October the 30th, right before Trump's election defeat. This call was to reassure Beijing that the president's words would not translate into military action. According to the book by Woodward and Costa, these were Milley's exact words when he spoke to Lee on the phone. Quote, "General Lee, I want to reassure you that the American government is stable and everything is going to be okay. We are not going to attack or conduct any kinetic operations against you." Unquote. The second call was on January the 8th, 2 days after the US Capitol attack. Milley used the secret back channel with Lee again after the riot to reassure him that the government was 100% steady. But that wasn't all. Mark Milley even went a step further. He asked the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific Command to postpone military exercises that Beijing might have viewed as a possible threat. But it's not just Beijing that Milley was also reassuring in Washington. He reassured House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that the system had a lot of checks to forestall extreme behaviour by Trump. Pelosi's call to him came right after the attack on the US Capitol, where she asked him if there were precautions available to stop an unstable president. Milley even told his top staff that if Trump decides to exercise his power to order a nuclear strike, they had to inform him about it first. The question now that many are asking is, did the top US general take things too far, going behind the back of a president and assuring Beijing of stability, especially at a time when relations between the two were at an all-time low? The other accusation made in the book is that he actively undermined the commander-in-chief, overstepping his authority like no other general in the history of the United States. Republican senators now, like Marco Rubio, are calling on Biden to fire Milley, accusing him of working to actively undermine the sitting commander-in-chief. Rubio said that Milley's behaviour set a dangerous precedent that threatened to tear apart America's long-standing principle of civilian control of the military. Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley now goes before Congress on September the 28th. It was supposed to be about the Afghanistan pullout, but it looks like the main focus will now be on his behind-the-scenes action during the Trump presidency. As the United States faces backlash for the messy troop pullout from Afghanistan, the country is attempting to do some damage control. Former presidents have joined hands to support Afghan refugees who fled to the United States. They've launched a single-point entry website to make the donation process easier. Take a look at this report.
3 former U.S. presidents, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, have banded together behind a new group aimed at supporting refugees from Afghanistan settling in the United States. The former U.S. leaders and their wives will serve as a part of Welcome.us, a coalition of advocacy groups, U.S. businesses, and other leaders launching on Tuesday. In a statement, Welcome.us said it will help tens of thousands of Afghans fleeing their country following the U.S. withdrawal by mobilizing support and volunteers. In the statement, George W. Bush and his wife Laura said, quote, "Thousands of Afghans stood with us on the front lines to push for a safer world, and now they need our help. We are proud to support Welcome.us and the work to help Afghan families get settled and build new lives." Representatives for Bill Clinton and his wife, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama and his wife Michelle could not be immediately reached for comment. The Council also draws support from more than 280 people and entities, including U.S. businesses such as Microsoft, Starbucks, CVS Health, and Airbnb, as well as numerous nonprofit organizations, veterans groups, and resettlement agencies. Tens of thousands of refugees were airlifted out of Afghanistan in recent weeks in a hasty pullout that drew some sharp criticism. Democratic President Joe Biden's administration is working to accommodate as many as 50,000 refugees on military bases in the United States. Republican former President Donald Trump was not listed as part of the effort. Former Democratic President Jimmy Carter, who is 96, was also not listed.
September the 15th marks the first anniversary of the signing of the historic Abraham Accords, the normalization agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It was soon joined by Bahrain, Sudan and Morocco. So how do these accords come about? And what does it mean for the future of the region? Our correspondent Jodie Cohen brings you this report.
Since the establishment of modern-day Israel in 1948, the Arab states have rejected its existence. The 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition and no negotiations were the policy of the Arab world for decades.
After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East.
However, 1 year ago today, we witnessed history with Israel's then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, UAE's Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, and Bahrain's Foreign Minister Abdulatif bin Rashid Al Zayani joining then President Trump at the White House. Together, they signed the first normalization agreement between Israel and an Arab country in over 25 years. Just 1 year later, now half of the Arabs across the world live in states that recognize Israel. And before he left office, former President Trump indicated that several more countries were willing to sign the accords. The Abraham Accords were named after the biblical Abraham to emphasize the shared origins of both Judaism, the main religion in Israel, and Islam, the main religion of the Arab world. For the people, these agreements have already had a positive impact, from direct flights and flourishing tourism to new friendships and business deals. Let's take the diamond trade as one example. From non-existent or covert relations between traders in Israel and the UAE, trade is now beginning to boom. Dubai had $21.2 billion worth of diamonds traded last year, and Israel had around $12 billion. The two countries are the Middle East's main diamond centres, and the prospects for business together are enormous. I spoke with Joe Eshkenazi, an Israeli diamonds trader with Divine Diamonds, which has started trading with the UAE, about what the Abraham Accords means for him personally and his business.
Now with the Abraham Accord, it's become a lot easier. Import and exports are possible. Direct flights, banking services are all possible today. And I think that our future is extremely bright.
So what has been achieved on the wider trade front? Firstly, the UAE. In just 1 year, Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics has reported over $570 million in business with the UAE, with the Associated Press reporting 25 agreements being signed in over 15 sectors. Israel's finance ministry expects business to reach $1 billion by the end of 2021 and $6.5 billion by 2025. Moody's Investors Service has valued Israeli exports to the UAE at $300 to $500 million a year and predicts UAE investments in Israel could reach $350 million a year. Secondly, Bahrain. Many collaborations between Bahrain and Israel have been announced. The two countries are cooperating in the oil and gas, logistics, information and cybersecurity, technology, manufacturing, financial services and healthcare, education, travel and tourism sectors. In January 2021, the National Bank of Bahrain signed MOUs with Israel's two largest banks. In March, Bahrain signed a $3 million agreement with Israeli national water company Mekorot to share knowledge and technologies. And initiatives have also started between medical centres in the two countries. These are big deals and big numbers. But what does it mean for peace across the region? Now, on the 15th of September, as well as being the anniversary of the Accords, this evening is also the start of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is the holiest festival in the Jewish calendar and a time for reflection on the past year. As far as the Abraham Accords are concerned, the reflection and expectations for the coming year will certainly be positive. This is Jodie Cohen from the Diamond Exchange Ramat Gan for WION World is One.
California's Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom has successfully retained office. Newsom beat a Republican campaign which aimed to unseat him over his policies on immigration, high-rising costs, homelessness and crime. In his victory speech, Newsom kept the focus on the virus.
We are enjoying an overwhelmingly no vote tonight here in the state of California. But no is not the only thing that was expressed tonight. I want to focus on what we said yes to as a state. We said yes to science. We said yes to vaccines. We said yes to ending this pandemic. We said yes to people's right to vote without fear of fake fraud or voter suppression. We said yes to women's fundamental constitutional right to decide for herself what she does with her body and her fate and future. We said yes to diversity. We said yes to inclusion. We said yes to pluralism.
In the final days of the race, he was accompanied by both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. The returns were apparent immediately after polls closed, with Newsom easily winning the majority support from voters, allowing him to stay in office. Newsom had been elected in a landslide in 2018. This recall vote had been eagerly watched by politicians across the deeply divided country. His defeat would have alarmed the Democrats, especially since California is one of the country's most liberal states. Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1 in the state, and polls consistently showed that the strong majority of voters there opposed recalling Newsom. Global temperatures are rising, glaciers are shrinking, sea levels are rising. At a time when climate change is threatening lives. An analysis carried out by the watchdog Climate Action Tracker has sounded an alarm. In its latest finding, it's discovered that none of the major world economies, including the G20, have a concrete climate plan that meets their obligations under the 2015 Paris Agreement. The watchdog analysed the policies of 36 countries, as well as the 27-nation European Union, and found that all major economies were far off the mark of being able to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, rather than achieve the containing of emissions. These are the countries that together make up 80% of the world's emitters. Meanwhile, on the African continent, the Gambia was the only nation to abide by the 1.5 degree target. The other country that has showed improvements in containing global emissions is the United Kingdom. According to the report, the UK's climate policy is nearly sufficient. But there are still many developed countries that have failed to abide by the Paris Agreement on climate. The overall climate plans of the United States, the European Union and Japan are not sufficient to reach the 1.5 degree goal. Under the Paris Agreement, countries pledged to cut emissions known as Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. All these signatories were meant to update their NDCs by July the 31st this year, and the countries to miss the deadline were India, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Not only this, but China, the world's biggest polluter, has announced a new target, which it failed to submit to the United Nations. There were also countries that submitted an updated NDC without actually increasing their pledge. To name just some of them, Mexico and Brazil submitted the same targets as they did back in 2015. Meanwhile, the countries that have completely failed in their climate policies are Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Switzerland and Vietnam. These nations have submitted the same or even less ambitious targets for 2030. According to the UN Climate Change, over 130 countries have pledged to cut emissions, out of which only a fraction of them are on track to contain global warming. Australia has reported a 13% jump in cybercrime in the past year. It comes as work from home setups have left more people vulnerable to online attacks. The Australian Cyber Security Centre says that it's received at least one cybercrime report every 8 minutes over the 12 months up until June the 30th. According to the Assistant Minister of Defence, Andrew Hastie, hackers are using COVID-19 to actively target those who are vulnerable. They're also been targeting healthcare services to conduct espionage, aiming to steal money and get access to sensitive data. Ransomware incidents have also increased by nearly 15%. The health sector has reported the second highest number of attacks. In June last year, Australia said it was being targeted by a sophisticated state-based cyber actor. Attacks targeted all levels of the government, including political parties and essential service providers. Australia viewed China as a suspect, but China denied the allegations. In July this year, the United States and its allies accused China of a global cyber espionage campaign. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken called it a major threat to economic and national security. Well, next this morning, the first all-civilian spaceflight crew is set to blast off for a 3-day mission. When to watch and what to know? Our next report has all the answers.
The SpaceX rocket Falcon 9 takes off from Kennedy Space Center, run by NASA. The rocket is chartered by American billionaire Jared Isaacman, who is also the captain. On the Crew Dragon capsule, there are 4 passengers on a 3-day orbit around the Earth without any professional astronauts. The 2 women and 2 men have spent several months training, even though the flight is fully automated. Their sleep, heart rate, blood and cognitive abilities are analysed. The objective is to accumulate data that could open space to a greater number of people. Up until now, only a privileged few have had the experience.
Well, the next story may be distressing to some viewers. More than 1,400 dolphins were massacred in a single day in Denmark's Faroe Islands. What you're seeing now is some disturbing visuals from a beach there. Slaughtered dolphins were lined up on the shore where the water has turned red with their blood. Activists are outraged by what they've seen. But in the place where it happened, hunting dolphins is legal. In fact, in the Faroe Islands, it's part of tradition, one that has continued for over 400 years. Dolphins here are killed for their meat. Each year, islanders drive herds of the sea mammals, chiefly pilot whales, into shallow waters, where they're killed. However, the recent slaughter has been criticised even by some residents who take pride in the activities. Authorities have been distancing themselves from the incident, with no one so far taking responsibility. People overseeing the hunts have said that they were not informed about this one. Shocking as it may sound, dolphin hunting, though, is not very uncommon. It's still participated in and practised in several nations around the world, including Iceland, Japan, Kiribati, Peru and the Solomon Islands. Well, do you know which country has the world's largest variety of butterflies? It's Colombia. Our next report tells you how one man's efforts helped the Latin American nation to achieve it. Take a look.
Photographing butterflies started as a hobby for 65-year-old Joan Jaramillo. But it soon took an unexpected twist. After spending years documenting the insects, the photographer went on to co-author an inventory. His work led to Colombia being recognized as having the largest variety of butterfly species in the world. The country has so far identified more than 3,640 different species. They account for nearly 20% of the known global varieties.
Este estudio es muy importante porque es como
The checklist of Colombian butterflies is very important because it's like the cornerstone from where now on, the new species of butterflies that appear in Colombia will continue to be built on. It is a legacy for future generations.
Es un legado a las futuras generaciones donde le estamos.
Studying butterflies has become Jaramillo's main profession. The 65-year-old earlier used to run an animal feed business. Jaramillo insists that he is not a collector but a conservationist. While collectors kill butterflies, the photographer has been advocating against deforestation, which is destroying the insect's habitat. Butterflies are not just beautiful creatures, but they are also pollinators, important to the ecosystem. Apart from this, the insects are a major source of food for birds and snakes.
Son unas excelentes polinizadoras.
They're excellent pollinators, and in nature, there are thousands of butterflies and moths from practically the same group of insects. There are thousands of species, and each one with millions of specimens pollinating all the plants in the world.
Y cada una de ellas con millones de ejemplares.
Jaramillo believes that there are more butterfly species in Colombia, and his mission will continue until he finds and documents every one of them. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Well, with that, we call it a wrap on this edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Nick Harper signing off, and for more global news and updates, stay tuned to WION World is One.
This is right, Arab.